My parents never had a sex conversation with us, never had a conversation around consent. All it was is once I was like 14 and I had a boyfriend, I was being very fresh. I was like, don't bring a baby to this house. Yeah. I'm an overachiever at work because for so long I've thought that I was a bad person because I repeated behaviors that happened to me.
I came to this conclusion the other day that I'm a really good liar. And don't take from that
you're a storyteller.
Hi, welcome to Secrets Worth Sharing, a series all about having practical conversations on childhood sexual abuse, but with serious joy. I'm Sophia, a designer and a survivor, and this very special and very requested episode is all about child-on-child abuse. And for that, I am joined by the wonderful, wonderful Sonia. Hi.
Hi, everyone. It's Sonia. My pronouns are she, they. I am a survivor, certified goofball, and feeler. Looking forward to joining and talking about my experience with child-on-child abuse today.
Sonia, is it all right before we launch into the conversation? You share quite a lot about the fact that you experienced child-on-child abuse yourself, but also that you've repeated some behaviours. So we just wanted to give people a bit of space and notice about that's what you're going to be talking about. I definitely want to say that I, for one, really endorse this conversation. I think it's extremely needed, and I think it's extremely positive to experience everyone in the wholeness of their abuse and what's happened to them and talk about those really realistic effects of that. But yeah, just wanted to give that a mention to people who are listening or watching. And also, if you wouldn't mind just giving a little bit of an overview about some of your experiences on child abuse.
Yeah. My journey kind of walks through quite a few things. First, starting out with my original abuse, which was from preteens and teenagers in my local community, which then turned into my family moving to the States from St. Lucia. And now all the things I had learned and experienced suddenly stopped because I was no longer with those people. But now I was repeating those same behaviors that I learned or experienced when I was around the original group of people who caused my sexual abuse. From there, that continued for a while until I learned differently and had to navigate where do I go with all of this new information. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm excited to share about, to hopefully be able to be a mirror for someone else who might have experienced something similar.
I'm so grateful that you chose to come on as well. Also, we should definitely highlight that, Sonia, you're joining from the States.
I am. Yeah, this is Secrets Worth Sharing. It's going international.
Literally. As we like to say, what is it? Across the pond?
Across the pond, yeah. That's it. That's exactly it. The experience is universal, and just super excited for the work that you're already doing and how that's going to be able to reach the masses everywhere.
So this episode is very close to my heart because for a number of reasons. But I really try and focus a lot on things that are ignored when we talk about childhood sexual abuse, and the topic itself is completely ignored. But then within that, when we do think about childhood sexual abuse, we tend to think about a very stereotypical situation, right? We think about a young cis girl, kind of like me, who's abused by a cis man who's older and an adult. That only encapsulates a tiny amount of the sorts of experiences that people experience. And I put out an open call saying I wanted to speak to people from this range of intersections on childhood sexual abuse. I was looking at autism. I wanted to speak to sex workers. I wanted to speak to people who'd experienced child abuse. And of the 30 people who got back to me, which in itself was a bit overwhelming, was 15 people who'd said that they had that experience. And I think it just goes to show how a majority of the time we're not used to thinking about that as being child sexual abuse when it absolutely is. So I'm really grateful to you, Sonia, because I think you have particular experiences that encapsulate a lot of why that is. So I wanted to kind of start and put a lens on this conversation around almost comparing our experiences. And I'm not saying that in terms of comparative trauma, because that's a whole other kettle of fish.
Yeah.
But when I say comparing our experiences, I mean, what do people think about in childhood sexual abuse, and how is that different when the person doing the abusing is an adult versus when they're a child, and what does that impact play on the person who's the child themselves?
Yeah, I think that's such a major key when we think about what are the levels around child-on-child assault, and when's the line of innocence, and I think that's really where you really determine what's a child. Is the line for a child once you're past the age of 10? Is it 12? Where do we draw the line in the sand on this was child on child abuse? And how do we view that compared to abuse that might have been with an adult or someone who should have known better? And how do we determine someone knowing better? In my case, my introduction to any of my sexual experiences were with preteens and teenagers. They're not necessarily children, but when I think about the experience and what they would have been exposed to and the knowledge that they had, I view it from a space of innocence from them where they may have not known better. So you have an idea that something's wrong, but you don't know exactly to the extent and why it's wrong and what's the downstream impact of what you're doing compared to an adult who should have had exposure to information around sex and consent from a socialized perspective. And how does that play into how you're responding and what they're doing with children or others? And that's just a very big part. While I am in the States, I think something that's important to note is that I was born in St. Lucia. So a lot of this experience started.
We love St. Lucia.
All the
All the piton, everything.
Yeah. the full vibe. But I think it plays a part into how I view the people who introduced me to any part or who created my abuse. I still get very weary about what to call it. The language around it is very dicey. Because I do hold space for their innocence in the experience. For context, so we're born on this very tiny island with parents who are doing the best that they can, but they aren't always present. Conversations around sex and body autonomy are not very common conversations that are happening. So you leave a bunch of kids to their own devices. At the time in the 90s, it was very much free community. You can go wherever. If you were doing something that was not acceptable, someone that you may not even know, but may know your parents, they were allowed to discipline you. So the idea that you would just be at someone's house was not uncommon, and that leaves room for space around. You don't know where your kids are all the time and who they're with. So my parents were traveling a lot, and I spent time in one smaller part of the community north of where my family was. And there were just a bunch of teenagers and preteens running wild, taking care of each other. And in that space, that's the context of where I was introduced to this behavior around sexual intimacy between children, like a very common thing. And like something's not quite, like it's still in secret, but no one's like, this is wrong. There was never the big scary conversation of if you tell anyone I'm going to harm you, like that wasn't even really discussed. It was just always in the air of this is a secret private thing that's happening, but it wasn't what I see in the media of like, well, I didn't say anything because someone told me that they were going to harm me or no one's going to believe you. Like that was not my experience.
And I guess, was there ever a moment where you realized that what you experienced was abuse?
Yeah, that happened years later. And at that point, I had already been repeating behaviors with children who were younger than me. So now you've taken this long period of time where this has been going on for a while. I have now been repeating behaviors with children who are younger than me, and I'm the older one in the space of authority. And, you move to America and you start going to school and there's sex education classes and you start having these conversations about how these things are wrong. And these aren't conversations I'm having at home. So now I'm getting messaging that like the things that I'm doing are bad and not okay. And I can't go talk to my parents about any of these things because I don't have that relationship with them. And now I'm internalizing this message, like all of these things are bad. Where do we go? And ever since then, you hold on to this thing that like, I am wrong. So it wasn't until I was around 10 or 11 that I realized like, oh, these things are bad. They can't happen. And from 10, 11-ish, all the way until 17, I never was able to articulate what happened to me. I had just internalized it as I was a bad person who did bad things.
And when you were, basically, there's so many things you've said that really really differ from my experience, but also that further add to the barriers of not just recognizing that what you experienced was sexual abuse, but then knowing how to talk about it and get support. And I think one of the biggest ones is what you said about the differentiation between when is a child. Like, because for example, you know, I was speaking to someone the other day who was processing their abuse that they experienced when they were like 8 years old, then went to therapy and was talking about a sexual experience that they'd had when they were like 14. And then the therapist goes, it was almost like the therapist was being like, hate to break this to you, hun, but the 14-year-old experience is also child sexual abuse. So then this person's like, what the fuck? Like, just let me have one sexual experience that is not child sexual abuse.
That's not tainted already by something else, yeah.
Exactly. And I think especially with this conversation on children, like, yes, the way you have conversations about sex, sexual safety, relationships, and also consent are going to be so different to somebody who's 14 than with someone who's 8 or 5 or 3. But it doesn't mean that the abuse still didn't happen. It just happened in a different vicinity. And obviously, like, you know, when you're younger, like at least when I was a teenager, it was exciting to be the one talking about sex and having all of these thoughts and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So
did you find that you were one of the few people in your friend group? Like when I became a teenager, I was like super well researched on sex because I was trying to make sense of my experience when I was a child being abused. But back then on the internet, all the context around sex was really from a consenting like adult perspective and not from you've been abused. How do you make sense of it now? So all of the information I was consuming online was like how to give the best blowjob or all of these other things. So like, I feel like in my friend group in high school, I was always like way further ahead of everyone when it came to conversations around sex. And like, I have these conversations with my friends now who've known me back then. Like, there were warning signs, y'all.
Come on.
I mean, like, that was like the fact that I was like always having a conversation about sex and I always knew so much was like, that was a little warning sign. I was not.
That's so, no, I didn't, in short. That's very interesting. Because how old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I just turned 30.
Oh, congratulations. Oh, yeah! Because before we spoke, happy birthday, like little. I'm 27, and I remember Googling around specifically child sexual abuse. And I think this is a very key distinction to make because by that point in society, I'd had enough messaging to sort of know if an adult touches you in a certain way, you need to be wary of this, that, and the other. And actually, it was the first person who told me you have experienced abuse. They didn't use that words, but was a child themselves. So their parent had a conversation with them. And then I was just
you had the language going into it.
Exactly. Right? So like
when I'm on Google, like is kissing bad?
Exactly.
Is touching bad? Because I don't have the language that says, because when the conversation around sex happened, it was never from school. It was never from the context of here's the body and here's what happens and here's consent. There was never a disclosure for if these things are happening, then that's a different conversation. And that's where it was. I don't have the language to go on Google and say, exactly. Is this, is kissing bad? Is touching bad? Is X, Y, and Z? Is kissing your brother bad? Where does that send you? Pornhub, step-brother video kissing, right? Like those are...
Exactly. And that is such a good point because on top of all of that, so the friend, I mentioned off the fly, oh, do you ever have it where, I don't know, adult touches you here? And the friend stopped gaming and was like, you need to tell somebody, otherwise that's going to happen straight away. And I didn't, but that reaction from that friend, from that other child, made me think, oh my God, maybe this is wrong. And that's when I sort of, in the back of my head, just started looking around for anything around childhood sexual abuse or like sexual assault when you're young. And then when I looked on the charity website, there weren't no mention about other children doing the abuse. It was just like, if someone touches you wrong, or if it's an adult that touches you wrong, like it could be a parent, it could be an uncle or whatever. And then you're like, oh, okay, cool. And still, I was reading through this information being like, oh, I'm not sure if this applies to me. I'm not sure if this applies.
Yeah, we never know.
Yeah.
Because we're always, I think it's our like way of defending ourselves. We want to make sure that like, this isn't what happened here. It's something else. Because if it is what's happening here, all of the defenses that should be happening in our lives would be. So since it's not happening, right? Like if I'm being abused, then my mom should know. And since she doesn't really know, then that might not be the case because it's still happening. So it must be something else. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it.
And there's such little representation, at least in the UK, that when a scandal does come out, it will be from like a huge public celebrity who's like abused many people, and there's been lots of, I don't like to use the word extreme, but there's been multiple situations of the person being abused in lots of different ways and levels. And that creates a picture in your head that there's a certain type of person who's an abuser, which is this type of person. And there's a certain type of experience which equates to you being a victim, which is this type of experience. And to undo that thinking takes decades. And I still to this day don't know where there is an actual concrete resource where you can actually get that affirmation. And even if there was, you're still going to be at the back of your head trying to find examples to be like, no, it's not me. Because it's not nice. It's not a nice conclusion about your life to come to.
No, it touches coming to the realization that your sexual experience has been violated. It touches every facet of your life. There's nothing, and I explain this to people, like there is no part of me that's untouched by this experience. The way that I navigate my dating, the way that I navigate how I show up at work. Yeah. I'm an overachiever at work because for so long I've thought that I was a bad person because I repeated behaviors that happened to me. So I am always trying to compensate for that. I keep people away from me because I feel like I'm dangerous. I still have the view that I work through in therapy that I'm a predator. Because once you do the research, it's either yes or no when it comes to child abuse, right? When we talk about childhood sexual assault or abuse, it's always someone's a victim, someone's a perpetrator.
Yeah.
And when you get into a conversation around multiple children, that's very complicated. And someone has to, from the representation that exists, fall into one of those roles. And I had a really difficult time, and I still do, coming to terms with this. And I've been in therapy for years, and we still end up having to circle back to the conversation that it was not your fault. It was not your fault. You didn't know any better. You couldn't have known any better. It was not your fault. You're not a predator. And I have to repeat that to myself often because it's still always embedded in my head. Because when we go out into the world and we look for others, the experience is someone was a little cute, innocent cis girl, like you said, that's the representation, right? There's this cute little innocent cis girl and this aggressive predator who took advantage of them and all of these other things. And what we leave out of that story are the children who are left to their own devices. And maybe one child A was abused by an adult, and now they're spreading that from child to child. Maybe it was teenagers, wherever it is that's created it. We still end up holding that shame of now I'm also a predator.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought this up in terms of there's an abuser, there's a victim, because there's this movement called the abolition movement. And basically, for people who don't know, the abolition movement is about a world without prisons and a world for reviewing the way justice works. And there's loads of different ways that works and loads of different approaches to that. One that I really like is by Cradle Community, who is a group of people with lived experience in prisons or know people who've gone through that system. And there's a lot of things that they say that I really agree with. There's a lot of things when it comes to child sexual abuse that I'm still trying to iron out and understand how that works. But one thing that they say that I think is very powerful is that we as a society are so obsessed with the concept of there's good and bad actions that equate to good and bad people. And when you create a whole society around that premise, it's completely flawed, and you don't allow for learning. You don't allow for a chance for people to actually get the justice that they need, which doesn't necessarily equate to the court and justice system that we know of in the States and in the UK. I think it's really tricky when it comes to adult perpetrators of sexual assault, because particularly when they're multiple offenders, and I truly don't know the answer, like nobody at me, like I don't know what to do when there is someone like that, and how to stop them from reoffending and where to put them and what, anything like that. But when it comes to children and people who are still learning, I think we often forget that as you said, we repeat behaviors. And I would really like to as well to take the time to give the grace to you, because the amount of vulnerability that you've shown just to even come on the platform and just say, yes, I went through this experience as a child, but yes, I also repeated the behaviors, takes a huge amount of strength. And I really like the way you're phrasing it as repeating behaviors, because that's what you're doing as a child, especially when you don't know any better, and especially when you've gone through that experience yourself. And I think, as you've said, it's taken years of learning that was what happened to you, first of all, understanding that you then did that, and I don't know what accountability looks like for you or whatever, but then going through the process of trying to undo that and then come on a platform, I think is extremely bold and powerful, and I think more people need to be hearing about this. So I'm just so happy that you came on, honestly.
Yeah, no, thank you for putting the feeler out for it in particular, right? Because you knew that this is important. I think there's so many of us who are halfway healed on our journey because we can only deal with half of our experience. And we can never be free until we can live our full truth, right?
Yeah.
And, if you curse in front of a child, chances are they're going to curse again. If you walk a particular way, that's going to happen. My best friend's in the military, and his sons, they love putting on his helmet and playing military and playing army. If he was a doctor, his children would probably do the same thing. They'd want to wear, the scrubs, and here's the full nine. So when we think about how children are this way, and I look out into the landscape of people talking about childhood abuse, and I don't hear this part, I think it hurts me, because I think about how many people are still sitting in pain with the other side of their experience, the and then what, that they can't say because it feels so hard to admit, because we're internalizing this part of the predator where we just want to be validated first.
I really wanted to ask you how you feel about this. So I imagine there's going to be people listening who are parents who will think, this is never going to happen to me because I've had that chat with my child. And I think, first of all, having that chat does not necessarily mean then abuse isn't going to happen. And especially if you're framing it as one chat, because we know that true learning about this is gradual. It's over a long period of time. It changes as the child gets older. And it's also about protecting your own body, but also understanding and recognizing your own behaviors. And so often, I get parents who are quite perplexed coming to me saying, but I spoke to my child, so I don't understand why they then got abused. And I think it's just really giving space to understand that it's not just one conversation. It's a movement, and it's a very conscious checking in with a child that happens over a long period of time.
I think there are a lot of folks in the work of healing that talks about how trauma is not what happened to you. It was what didn't happen in response to the trauma. Yeah. And when I think about parents who are like, well, I did have that conversation with my child to say, this should not happen to you. And if it does, tell me. These are your no-no zones, so no one should touch them. That gives them the framework to know what is right or wrong. The second part of that is, have you created the space where your child would be comfortable coming to share with you something going wrong? Because we're going to internalize it. When something, they tell you, like, children are very self-centered because we haven't understood like a world view yet. So if I'm being harmed, it doesn't really matter if I have that space. You're automatically going to think it's something wrong with you. We do it as adults, not even just children, right?
Absolutely.
You're out in the world and you're leaving from the bar or from a date and you're assaulted. And the first thing we do is we internalize it. Like, I did something wrong. Did I send the wrong message? This is what adults with fully developed brains do. So imagine a child, right?
Yeah.
Who hasn't had a fully developed brain. We're going to internalize the experience as something that we did wrong. From parents, the conversation really should be, how well am I creating space for my children to tell me when they've done something wrong? Because that's the ultimate marker. If we're going to internalize it as something that I've done wrong, I need to be able to come to you and tell you that I made a mistake. I made a mess in my room. And how do you respond in those moments is going to inform how I think you're going to respond when I tell you this truth about myself or this truth about what I experienced. And that's really where parents have an opportunity to take it a step further.
And also, if the child does still come to you, you're most likely not the first person that they've come to. They've probably gone to their friends who are other children first. So if anyone then comes to me and is like, but I had that chat with my child, then I kind of flip it on its head. And I'm like, okay, regardless of whether or not your child is going through a negative abuse experience sexually, they are definitely going to be hearing negative abuse experiences of others who might not be able to talk about it. So how are you going to make sure that your child is able to talk to you about someone else so that you can help get them the support they need? And I think that leverages into something quite powerful that you told me last time that we spoke, when you were, I can't remember exactly, but you'd moved from St. Lucia to the States, and then it was actually your friend's mother that kind of talked to you about. Yeah, could you tell me that story?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the time where I've spent my time of being like, and I think you asked me this a little bit earlier, like, when did I know that this was wrong? And how do I pull it all together? And there isn't one particular moment I can pinpoint, like, I was here and this was this, but there are certain things that I know that stick out the most. One, being exposed to certain part in sexual education. And two, my mom's best friend who, like, any like most ethnic people, you just call everyone auntie, even though you're not really related to them. My mom's friend, who was like an auntie at this point, and she had a daughter, and we spent a lot of time together. And she was having those conversations with her daughter around me, and I'm listening. Like, and her daughter was like 3 to 5 years younger than me, but I'm listening to these conversations like, this is okay. We go from like being in class and learning about sex to now hearing a conversation about what shouldn't happen in your like no zones, which I think this is something that you advocate for, by speaking very directly to children about it and not putting nicknames and fluffs around what the topic is, so they can really get to the heart of it. But yeah, she's having this conversation that I would have never had. My parents never had a sex conversation with us, never had a conversation around consent. All it was is once I was like 14 and I had a boyfriend, I was being very fresh. It was like, don't bring a baby to this house. And that was it. Don't bring a baby to this house, period. Don't bring a baby to the house did not come with a conversation around condoms, did not come with a conversation around birth control. It was, don't bring babies to this house. And that was the end of the sentence. And to be in a space with someone like her, who's like having this conversation with her daughter, and I'm like, oh, you don't do that. These things aren't supposed to happen. And I'm trying to make sense of it because she's also not my parent, right?
Yeah.
So you're getting information from an authority figure that's not your parents. And that's where we get our moral standing. So it's very like odd trying to get the information from the outside. And that tied to this secrecy of like, how do I balance? Like, what does this mean? This is where I turned to Ask Jeeves at the time. Before, for anyone who's
Jeeves,
young,
what a throwback that was.
Before Google, we would go to Ask Jeeves, and it was this character who was this guy, and you type your question, and Jeeves would give you the information you needed. So I would get on Ask Jeeves to figure out, trying to piece together all of these stories and experiences, and like the material and the information that was available was not always very clear. And that most of it usually ended up directing me back to porn because of what I was searching. I didn't have the language to search for the specific, like the word abuse. I don't think I ever searched specifically abuse until I was like a little bit older and I can get a little bit more information. But initially it was just like, I think I'm like at 9 at this point on the internet, like looking at porn because this is what's coming up. And I'm like, more confusing messaging around this thing. And that's where, when we have these conversations, we're talking to adults, but there is a space to be protective of children who are experiencing it in the moment, who may not know where to go. And what are they searching and what are they finding? And hopefully they're finding secrets worth sharing.
I love how you're just plugging me without me even needing
I'm being
to.
so serious. Like, I kid you not, what you're doing is, I would have killed for something like this. To be able to have found a platform where I can go listen to other people talk about their experience and not just the pretty version of it. Because you can go on Google and you can search for childhood sexual assault and you're going to find that perfect version, right? The young child, the older adult, the uncle. And I mean, I did have an adult later, once we moved to America, who did abuse me, but he wasn't the start of my abuse. He was just on that journey, right? I was abused by multiple people. He just happened to be one of them, but that's not what I was looking for. Everyone doesn't fit into the mold of what's put on TV, where it's easy to have empathy. It's easy to have empathy for the victim who comes from a family who has it together, and it shouldn't have happened to her. She goes to Catholic school and she's gorgeous and she's smart and she does sports and she's well-rounded. And how could this abuse happen to her? Oh my gosh. And she deserves empathy, of course, in her experience, and not to take away from that. But there are a slew of other people who don't feel worthy of their experience because it's not reflected as the same. This comes up on Twitter, right? Like pretty privilege. Like there's threads that are like, oh, people don't talk about the downside of being pretty. We're more likely, like we get assaulted all the time. And it's comments like that people don't realize completely negates the fact that like unattractive people are assaulted too.
Absolutely. And the reason why I was giggling a little bit when you were describing that kind of picture perfect victim was that is me. Other than the being good at sports bit, I would say I'm gorgeous, but you know.
Not an athlete. Because you're not an athlete, our empathy score for you went down like 2%.
Literally, yeah. Oh God, I can't be perfect. But this is the thing, like, and I was extremely aware of that when I set up this platform, which is why I was like, I don't want it to just be me speaking to other people who look like me. And I think other than being blonde and looking more white and maybe being grown up around more money, I think in so many ways I am that person. And I think that's why I hope that it can be a lens to kind of allow people to see, okay, not everyone who goes through childhood sexual abuse experiences things in that exact same way. And also, when you add, like, for example, for me, like the Vietnamese cultural lens on top of that, you know, there's so many additional barriers. And so all the stats we have on child sexual abuse are wrong in the first place because they're not accounting for so many experiences. And, you know, there's probably people who might be listening to this now and be thinking, oh God, I didn't even know child on child abuse was a thing. Like, I was following this platform for so long and I just thought it was a very certain type of abuse. So yeah, just really, really wanting to give space to that. And also, as you were talking, I wrote some notes because you talk so much about innocence, and I think it's something we really need to highlight here because we've both grown up with ethnic parenting. I'm going to call it ethnic for ease.
Yeah.
And I think in a very like stereotypical ethnic household, if you don't talk about the thing does not exist.
Not exist. Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? Therefore, if we don't talk about sex, they're not fucking. It's all good. If we don't talk to them about privacy and like having to protect themselves, they're not going to need to protect themselves. It's simple logic.
Yeah,
exactly.
And you know what's the wildest part about that, especially with, I can only speak from my experience, and all I know is my ethnic background, is that they have experienced, our families have experienced some of the most fucked up shit.
Yeah.
Like, and it's like in this attempt to protect, they never think to expose us to the truth. And that's this thing of like wanting to, like, I'm going to protect your innocence. I don't want to expose you to this part of life and this reality, but it's going to happen. Like you said, right? It's either going to happen because it's happening to me, or maybe they're going to find out from someone in school, and that's their exposure to it. And it's just this weird dynamic that happens. Like, we're not going to talk about it. But then I don't understand the cognitive dissonance that happens where it's like, you yourself have experienced some of the most fucked up shit in the world.
Yeah. So often there is that generational trauma, which is where it's like, I've gone through this thing, therefore I don't want my child to have to experience that. And out of love, that's where they create this environment of safety, which often equates to not talking about it. And, you know, I'm sure there's loads of white families that have this as well. Like, I'm sure, especially back in the day, you know. Mm-hmm. But what I find very interesting is that there doesn't seem to be that kind of jump to think, oh, they're still going to be brought up in a world where I can protect them all I want. But for them to survive in society, they're going to have to go out and they're going to learn all of these things. Yeah. And I think we forget that, you know, I remember being taught how to dutty wind on the playground to collect boys in year 4. In year 4. So I must have been about, like 7 or 8. And my friends were there like, yeah, you've got to like push your ass upwards and then like imagine you're rowing a boat with your hips. And I was like, okay. And I was trying really hard and I was like, I can't do this.
You're like, because this is the thing. Like, once you're in school, you have everything else that's happening outside that's being brought in. So you don't,
Yeah.
I want to protect. I won't we're not going to address it because I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to let them they're not going to go to any other babysitter. I'm always going to watch them. My parents are, and even that's very flawed when we look at the numbers, right? Of like, I'm only going to have them go to trusted family members, and most of the harm happens
in trusted environments.
Yeah.
And again, like, it's because this thing is so, and I'm not out there to blame any particular person. Like, it is a societal problem, like, worldwide, and I'm not out here to shame and blame any other parents, but it really is the reality of like, okay, fine, you don't allow your child to go to sleepovers. That's not therefore a solution to child sexual abuse. And also to the very realistic possibility that, as you said, your child could be exploring or repeating behaviours or exploring with siblings. And there's so many other ways that this manifests that isn't just, I'm just going to send them off to a sleepover.
Yeah, I'm not sending them anywhere because there's an adult. Well, like, is there a cousin coming over that maybe they're not playing with adults, and you make sure that your children aren't around adults, but they're playing with a cousin who's their age, who's repeating behaviors.
Yeah.
And now here's the experience that they're going through, and you don't know because you have kept them away from all the adults who are bad, and we're not thinking of there might be other children who are experiencing something. And this is not to say keep your child in a bubble and away from all other kids because you don't know. And this is why it's just important to have that conversation so it can be identified, because you don't know. It could happen in the school bathroom, like with another child. And there is also layers to what's considered abuse. Anything that's not something that you're consenting to and that you're ready for can be abused. So someone doesn't necessarily need to touch you, but little Billy pulls his penis out in front of your child on a playground. That can be traumatizing.
Of course.
And that is enough to know. Yeah.
And this is where I think one of the key distinctions between child-on-child abuse and people who abuse as adults is that I feel as though people who experience abuse from other children so quickly have that brushed off as, but they're experimenting, they were curious, they're just playing.
They're just playing.
Them just playing doesn't negate.
Are you sure you remember it right? Like, did it feel like, yeah.
Yeah, like them just playing doesn't negate the fact that I've had a traumatic experience. Just in the same way as a racist comedian just having a joke doesn't mean that you've just atted me in my race. You know what I mean?
And I think part of that, this is where it ties into what we were talking about around abolition, right? Part of why we are quick to brush off child-on-child abuse as just playing is because we still sit in a binary of, now this child's a predator because my child's the victim, which means the way we view predators and perpetrators of sexual assault is to the worst extent. So we have a hard time navigating the grace for other children in child-on-child abuse. So what are your options? You go, this child's a predator and this is bad, or you move right to just playing. And there is space in between them. There needs to be curiosity. What's happening here? Why is that happening? Like, yes, your child is harmed and you need to protect them, and you need to make sure that they're validated in their harm and they're getting the help that they need. And there's also this other child on the other side of this that needs to get support. Whenever I think about or I hear it, I'm like, something is happening. If someone that I might have harmed when I was a kid, when I was like 10 or 9, and look at me finding, I want to throw the age in there so bad because I don't want anyone to hear this and think I was like 13 or 14, because that's where I feel like the innocence line might be drawn. And like the age isn't relevant at this point, because anyway, it's just like, this is where your defenses go up of like, what's the line of innocence? But if someone were to find out, like, I think about this, like, had someone told their parent who came to my parents and said, hey, this thing happened, what's going on? Maybe they would have discovered that at that point, by the time I was repeating behaviors, there was an adult violating me.
Yeah.
And if that conversation would have happened where a kid was like, ring, 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 something's going on with Sonia, she's doing these things, maybe my parents could have intervened, because at that point there was an adult who was 20 years older than me in the picture who was abusing me, and there was no space for that now at this point. And that's where it's all very convoluted. And what's the right answer, right? How do we think about our responses to children experiencing abuse, and how do we address it? Because we're still very much like, this person is bad and this person's good. So now it's like, this little kid is so horrible and now we've got to keep him away, versus like urge to protect that child. And if we had that mindset, I feel like so many other children who might have had the similar experience with me where they're repeating behaviors could breathe. And that's all I want, is for anyone else who repeated behaviors to just be able to breathe and know that it was not their fault. I also have lots of thoughts and opinions on how, if you're unable to deal with the guilt, what do we do? You lean into the character.
Yeah.
If I think I'm a predator, I'm going to lean into that character. And I don't know what percentage of adult predators continued because they internalized the message, like, this happened to me, I did it as a child, so now I think I'm a bad person, so now I'm going to continue because I think this is my personality.
Yeah.
I'm destined to be a child abuser.
Yeah.
So now I just continue to do it as an adult. And I think if I never got an understanding that it wasn't who I was, maybe there's a chance, like, I think about this sometimes and it gets very scary. Like, there's a chance that, like, this path could have continued. And if we're not stopping it from this particular age, like, what's the difference between this started when I was a child and I started repeating behaviors and then I kept doing it? And then it's fine when I'm 10 because it was cute and it was not cute, but it was...
Yeah, please don't endorse it.
But like, when you're 10, you're like, you're innocent. You didn't know any better. Like, you didn't have it. And then once I'm 12, okay, you're getting a little older. You should be knowing a little bit better. And now I'm 15 and 16. And now I find that, like, 15 and 16 where people are like, you were bad. So now I get to 15 and 16 and now it's a problem. But maybe I got to 15 and 16 and I never had that conversation. Or I never internalized the material around it, because no one's talking about childhood sexual abuse in a very candid and direct way. So I can apply whatever context to it at 15 and 16. And now I'm 21 and now there's no hope for me. I'm done. Yeah. Right. And if we can't peel back, and, that's complicated. I don't even know how I feel about that.
Of course, because there's no dialogue for you to start to process. Yeah. And that's the thing, it's such an internalized thing, which is, again, why I'm so grateful that you're sharing all the layers. And we talked a lot about how we wanted to do this episode, and you were very adamant about talking about being the imperfect victim and everything that you've just shared and how that relates to that. And I think so often we don't get to see the gritty realness of the other realities of experiences of unwanted sexual experiences, right? And, like, there was so much there that you said. And it touches a lot to me on, like, boiling down simple language. We talked about innocence, right? Mm-hmm. When you give children other nicknames or names to talk about their private areas or their no-no zones or whatever it is, you don't allow them to disclose with as much freedom as if they were equipped with the language. So, for example, I've started this partnership recently with the CSA Centre. Basically, they train me up as certified in different types of abuse, and then I review how the training was. It's a very sweet deal, actually.
It's awesome.
And one of the ones that I was doing was on child abuse and sibling sexual abuse. There were two separate courses. And we had someone there who worked at a school, like as the wellbeing officer for a school. And she was saying, because they're always women who come to our trainings, she was saying that a child had come to her multiple times saying, oh, we play with each other's flowers. And you're thinking, oh, that's so cute. You play with daisies, you're making daisy chains together, like, you're whatever.
Flowers together from your garden.
Yeah. And then it turned out, exactly, so poetic. And then it turned out that actually both of the children were exploring sexual acts together. One was instigating the acts and the other one was kind of just going along with it. And when this all came out, one of the children said, but I did tell you. I was telling you that they touched my flower, and she didn't have the knowledge to be able to accurately describe those body parts. So fine, you kept them innocent. You gave cute names to their private parts. But now if those private parts get touched, they literally don't have the sphere of language or association to be able to tell you what's happened.
And every family has a different name for it. Your coconut, your flowers, there's always something else. So if they go to the school nurse, we're going with the assumption that they're going to come to you first and you're going to know what flowers are, versus them going to a school nurse and a teacher and say, like, my coconuts are being touched. And you're like, your coconuts, like, kids say things sometimes that you're not going to always think to be like, are you telling me you're being harmed?
Yeah. And also how we navigate that conversation, because like, okay, fine, you think the kids are playing with each other's flowers or coconuts or what. I've never heard coconut. That's very cute.
Caribbean
Not that
people.
But yeah, if someone's coming up and saying my coconut's being touched, my flower's being touched, whatever, and you respond with, oh, that's cute, without realizing, just like that, you've condoned the experience. You've endorsed it. You've endorsed the abuse, because you've said, I think that's fine, and therefore you've, without even realizing, silenced the potential disclosure.
It's so, when you think about it, it's such a big thing about why language is important. Why language is everything that we have in our like journey to reduce the impact of childhood sexual assault. Like language is it's the biggest thing. It's the biggest weapon that we have in our arsenal. Like,
yeah. And it's in exactly the same way you talked about as well, the line of innocence. Like, is it 13? Is it 14? Is it 9 or 10? Is it whatever? That line of innocence legally is different in every single country, you know? Yes. You can go to you can skip juvenile prison for severely assaulting someone sexually if you're under 12 in the UK. In other countries, it's 16. In other countries, and I know that in Scandinavia, it's even younger. And there's so many cultural definitions between what age is. And I think in exactly the same way that there's such a broad way for how we think about and talk about our private areas, it's exactly the same way for when we speak about age. But at the end of the day, if you are feeling harmed by the way you've experienced sexual experiences by someone else, then you've been harmed. And I think no layer of cultural boundary, legal definition, name for your penis or vagina or other body part is gonna affect that, we're recording this at the time of International Women's Week and the UN, all of the UN like status of, what is it called? The UN Congress for the Status of Women is currently out at the moment. And I remember seeing a quote somewhere from one of the ambassadors saying like, it is not up to you to decide whether or not your sexual actions harmed somebody. And I think that should almost just be the bottom line of it. Like, regardless of what your age is, and motivation is a very different thing. Motivation, regardless of your age, that's another story. But at the end of the day, if the person has done something and you feel sexually uncomfortable, regardless of whether you've been touched, whether it's been penetrative, whether it's something you've seen, whatever, it is validated as an experience of sexual abuse. And so often I see in cases of child-on-child abuse, it will be like, oh, Zeke's been flashing his bum and willy to all the kids in the class. Isn't that so funny? Obviously, we'll tell him off, slap his wrist, but isn't that so funny? Okay, now imagine Zeke's 25. It's a whole different conversation, isn't it?
Whole different conversation, yeah.
And so and of course, we need age-appropriate ways to talk about these discussions, but they still need to be treated with severity and integrity, or they're just going to be repeated, as in your case.
Absolutely. And it's, where can we as like adults now, right? We're no longer children. Where can we as adults continue to create space for the nuance so these conversations can happen? Because I think that the very black and white thinking and polarity that exists when we talk about childhood sexual abuse is a big driver in why people are afraid to broach a conversation.
Yeah.
Because the nuance doesn't exist. And I think as humans, we know that there is some barrier, there is all of this gray that exists when we talk about these things. And that makes it really difficult, I think, sometimes for people to know where to go. Because you're either going to choose black and white, but I think in our gut, as humans, we know that that's not the right answer for managing child-on-child abuse or any of those other categories really involving children.
I think as well, forgetfulness is very handy when people are avoiding conversations on child-on-child abuse.
Yeah.
You might catch your child displaying an inappropriate behaviour with another child and they're like 3 or under. And so you might think, okay, if we don't mention this again, maybe it's never going to come up. My one jokey answer to that is Nightmare on Elm Street. Didn't serve those kids very well, did it? When the parents locked it all away. It's a film, by the way, for anyone. It's a horror film for anyone who doesn't know. But like, it's back to that ignoring conversation. I think forgetfulness, particularly when it's with children and managing their memories, is so damaging because you don't know what a child remembers. I have really early memories of like my childhood house that I grew up in that my mum's like, that's crazy. Like, it's mad that you remember that the wallpaper was blue because like at the time you couldn't even speak. You know what I mean? And maybe I remembered that from a video.
Yeah, and certain things get imprinted and we don't know. Yeah, when we make the decision for what a child needs to know and we make the assumption, right, that we assume positive intent too much, that we end up creating that space of, like you said, like a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, they're just playing, they're 3. And, you know, like boys will be boys. Like they're just figuring out their bodies. And like the answer to it isn't go harsh and go all the way. And I think that's what sometimes people hear. You want me to tell my 3-year-old child that they should not explore X, Y, and Z and they shouldn't do these things? No, there's nuance that should happen in that conversation, but you have to start building the blocks for it because you can't go from never addressing it to now they're 16 and you're like, you get a phone call because your kid did something at school and you have to have this conversation now. Yeah. And you have none of the building blocks that have happened before to say, you're playing, but when you're playing, these are some things that you should be mindful of. This is happening. No, you don't touch your sister that way. You don't do this with your cousin. Like, these are things that you can start having those conversations before someone's a lot older and now you have to go figure out, how do I tell my kid?
Yeah. And at that point, you're in reactive mode, right? So you're either angry or in shock or in denial or any of those natural reactions that come when you're getting such negative news like that. Of course, but then that is going to go into your child. So it's like, right, so we've had no conversation about sexual health, safety, relationships, none of it. Now you're bashing me down. That conversation of communication, that line has been closed. Forget it. And instead of of course, it's a difficult conversation to have. Nobody in this world, me included, with the children in my life, wake up and go, wow, another day, another fresh chat with a child about keeping their bodies safe. Who's waking up thinking that?
I can't wait for my morning coffee and to talk about... Yeah,
Nobody. Yeah. Like, even me, like, I've chat about this shit all the time. And when I have to, I get sweaty when I have to talk to a child about it, or when I'm talking to a parent or a friend about whether or not I can talk to their child about it, or anything like that. It's not a conversation we want to have, but we want to be not having it. But I really would ask people to redress, where is that discomfort coming from? Because if the discomfort is coming from, you think it's inappropriate and you don't feel comfortable and you don't think it's necessary, then the chances are you really most likely need to be having that conversation. And we want to be preventative and equipping kids with their toolkit, just in the ways that you would teach them the alphabet if you want them to learn to read and write and speak. You're equipping them with the knowledge to make sure that, 1, they can keep themselves safe. 2, they can keep others safe by maybe being that voice of reason for other people who aren't having these conversations with their parents and kids. And 3, to make sure that they're not repeating those behaviours, or, you know, there's natural sexual curiosity. And there's a whole guide on this, by the way, which I'll link in the podcast. There's natural sexual curiosity, and then there is drawing the line. And it's very, very important to make sure that you are aware of it and that your kids are aware of it and other kids in your life from a very young age. Because, like it or not, we are sexually aware of our bodies from the age of 2. Like, even younger in some cases. And that doesn't mean there's a 2-year-old, one
who like wants to go get
wants a sesh. Exactly.
But there's this thing of like, you also don't want to, which is something that we see, right? Like, you have the ones who go to the extreme, like, I'm going to talk to my kids about it, and now we've made sex a very scary thing, and then we take the pleasure of this natural human experience away because we go into it. Yeah, there's a line that you dance with how you talk about it. That doesn't, because if we talk about it as like any sexual urges are bad before you're over a certain age, when you're having natural exploration with yourself, you're also going to internalize this message that like, oh, this is bad. You're just learning how to masturbate or whatever the case might be. And now you think it's bad because you've heard all these conversations around why not touching yourself is the best. So I love that you have a resource around healthy sexual exploration versus where's the line in the sand of now this is now harmful.
Yeah. And also, like, children, when I was talking about kids like being sexually aware of their bodies, you know, you might notice a toddler just touching themselves, like not even realizing what they're doing, but they're like, oh, that feels good.
That feels good.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to notice that feels good, and then they're going to keep doing it. Like, and yes, you could bat their hand away. Yes, you could tell them off. What is that kind of conditioning them to think? Or you could say, look, I mean, they're 2, so I mean, I guess at first you're just like,
maybe we'll say they're 5 for this.
Yeah, let's say they're 5. Let's say they're 5.
Yeah.
You can be like, look, like, there's a part of you touching you and it might feel good to you, but it won't make other feels good if you're doing it in front of them. And though, like, it could be as simple as that. And if you're worried about having that conversation, you can buy and review different age appropriate resources. But the answer is to not just bat it away and pretend it's not happening.
It's not happening, or shame them for it.
Yes, or shame them for it.
Because once you shame them for it, they're definitely not coming back to tell you anything, because now any part of that experience makes mom and dad angry.
I don't know if I'm going to really regret saying this, but I came to this conclusion the other day that I'm a really good liar. Like, and don't take from that you're
a storyteller.
I'm a exactly.
You're a storyteller. That's all it is.
Yeah.
You're a storyteller, and you're able to get into character. And that's where, think about earlier when we were doing the intros, and you like turned into like 3 different characters. Like, that's all it is. Not a liar. Framing matters.
That's so true. That's so true. Okay, cool. I feel better now. I was like, if I tell Sonia this, she's not going to believe anything I now say. But yeah, I came to the realization the other day that I'm a really good liar. And it was around my family, because like, it was over something so dumb. Like, one of my family members was like, shouldn't you be at work? Like, why are you here today? I mean, lovely to see you, but swear you're working. And at that time I was unemployed, but I didn't want anyone to worry. So I just spanned this whole story of like, yeah, I was working overtime, which is why I've got a day off today, which is why I've come to see you. Like, absolute bullshit. And then I was joking about it with my parents, and they kept giving me like little fake scenarios, and they're like, okay, lie your way out of this. And every time, like that.
You're like, got it.
Yeah, and I was like, where has that come from? And I think we've talked a lot about our parents protecting us and have gone through a lot themselves, and so therefore want to stop this badness happening to us. But we also don't talk about the flip side of that, which can sometimes be, you don't want to be a burden to them, so therefore it can just be really easy to spin this story or tell this white lie, or you can't be bothered to have a conversation about why you've chosen to give up your professional job to go freelance to do a podcast on child sexual abuse. So you just spin a little story, and then it just goes and builds. Yeah, and I think because sex is a shameful and scary subject for many reasons, in my case it was part culture, part religion, whatnot, you kind of get used to just exploring it on your own, and you're like, okay, you learn that that's a topic that you don't go to with your family, and that's fine. But then where are you getting your information? For you, it was porn. Yeah? For other people, it might be like exploring it with other children, or it's gossip, or it's when they get their first sexual partner, and you don't want those unsafe spaces to be happening.
Where you figure it out.
Yeah.
It's very, when you talk about like, there's 2 things that we just kind of touched on. One, like the part of you being a liar, and I'm like, oh yeah, you're a storyteller. And I'm like, when you're like, I wonder where this thing comes from. And I think about a lot of the other people that I know who've experienced childhood sexual assault, and we all seem to have the same.
Are we all pathological out here?
We are all great storytellers. We are able to, and because we've probably spent so much time in our minds making sense of our experiences, that we're just so good at pulling together a little story very quickly. We have to use our imagination to cope with, if you're not able to externalize it, you internalize it, and then you have to create a world to cope with the experience. And I definitely find the thread of all the people that I know who've experienced childhood sexual abuse, we all have really good angles at creating stories, and a lot of it ties back into our families. Like, how do I piece this together so you can consume what I'm telling you? Because there's always part of you for a really long time before you disclose that you're hiding.
Oh yeah.
And there's always a need to protect certain things. Like, how do you know about this? Well, like, I just did, right? Like when I was 14, talking about all this stuff I'm seeing on Pornhub. Well, I don't know if it was Pornhub at the time, but like whatever porn website, with my friends, I wasn't talking about how like my older cousin was touching me and abusing me. And like, that's like, you don't get to that point. So you have to figure out a way around some of these conversations for so long. Why do you do the things that you do? You can't disclose this part. So it comes with a pretty story. We're good at that.
Exactly. And you're not spoken to about any of these things, or it's such a no-go topic that you therefore are always thinking 10 steps ahead. So it's like, okay, I can't say that I went to this person's house because then they will know that I wasn't doing my homework. And I wasn't doing my homework because I was worried about my abuse. But then I can't say that because then they would start to notice this, that, and the other. Or like another.
Why don't you want to go to someone's house? That's a very common
This
thing,
is
right?
I was making one up on the spot, but that is perfect.
That's probably one of the biggest ones, right? You are now in a situation where you know that you're being abused, but you can't tell your family that you are. But they want you to go to that babysitter's house because mom and dad wants a date night because they're tired and work is hard. So they don't understand. You need to go here. But you don't want to, but you can't say why. We become good storytellers.
100%. And for me, it was homework. So I was like, how could I possibly go to the house over the half term and spend all week there when I have this huge project on the tutors to do? And I'm in year 6. What year 6-year-old? So for context, I was about 10. What 10-year-old is so busy doing their project on the tutors?
So overwhelmed with work. Yeah, like, I can't do this. I can't be bothered. Yeah. It's you storytell. Once I realized what was happening in the child on child abuse and I started internalizing it as I'm a predator, I no longer want it to be around those other kids or, my older cousin, but you can't say why. So I became a little recluse. Like, I don't want to hang out with people, but like, I'm not obnoxious, like, pay attention to me. But I just want to go in my room. Nothing's wrong with me. I'm just shy. I don't want to be around. No, I don't want to do this thing. And then you create this personality, whatever you need to get out of that thing.
Yeah.
If you loved playing soccer, but your coach or something's happening at soccer and you can't tell your parents, now you can't like that sport. Well, I just don't want to do it anymore because it conflicts with this thing or it's boring to me. And that might not be the truth. We become really good storytellers.
Absolutely. And there's so many elements of your character as well that change. So for example, I remember being so freaking helpful around the house whenever my abuser was around, because it was like, oh, I know that they're never going to go to the kitchen, so that must be the safe space. Oh, teach me how to cook. I love cooking, auntie. Do you want to show me how you make this?
Go be around every other adult, like, oh, I want to do this thing. I want to go here. Yeah.
Exactly. Or like, I really remember specifically one time, like, going to the park with my abuser and like he just kept wanting to push me off the tire swing and I was like, oh, I've hurt my leg today so I can't go on the tire swing. And like and then you think, okay, but then that means later he might use that as an excuse to then abuse me again. So now I've got to recover between the hours of 4 to 6 so that by bedtime I'm running around like, oh my God, my mind.
So it's nonstop, and that it doesn't just stop once the abuse stops. And that's a lot of what, like when you're in therapy, and like I'll have these sessions where I'm like, oh, I'm doing this thing and I don't get why. And we start peeling back the layers. I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? This too? Like the way, like how, like the fact that I need to wash my sheets frequently. Really? This too? Like, I don't know about you, but I've gone on this